and let me welcome you all once again to this third seminar on early medieval identities. If you missed the previous ones, they are recorded, so you can go back and read and recommend those. So my name's Jenny Neville, and today it's my really great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Miller Oberman. Dr. Oberman teaches poetry and writing at Eugene Lang College of the Liberal Arts, which is part of the New School in New York. And he did his PhD in English at the University of Connecticut under the supervision of Professor V. Penelope Pelitzon. I don't know if I've said that right or not. And his work embraces creative translation from Old English poetry and queer temporality theory, with the aim of creating intimate relationships across time and through time and space. And a particular focus of his work, one that I really enjoy, is the way he deals with damaged and incomplete texts. And his 2020 article on dure Kraft, precious skill, explores his process of translating riddle fragments from the Exeter book. His poetry collection, The Unstill Ones, which came out from Princeton University Press in 2017, and you can still buy it, and you should all buy it if you haven't got it already. You can stop listening now and go buy it now if you like. I'll give you a second. Yeah, okay, good. It was based on his PhD thesis, but his work, which has received many prestigious awards, has also been widely published in journals, including the Harvard Review and the London Review of Books. So his work's out there on the internet. You can find it, and with any luck, I hope you've already read his wonderful, wonderful version of Wolf and Edwalker. Poems from his current project, which is entitled Joshua, have appeared or are about to appear in The New Yorker, in Poetry, in Poem a Day, and Foglifter. So with his focus on connections between space, temporality, originality, identity, and artistic failure, he's an ideal speaker for our series. And today he's going to be talking to us about the other in self, embodied medieval translation in contemporary practice. Thank you, Miller.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and I'm so excited to be here with you, and thank you for having me, and thank all of you for coming. I suppose I'll start by saying that I'm joining you from Queens, New York, and from the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, where I currently reside, and greetings to you wherever you all are and whose ever land you're on. So yeah, I think I am going to speak a little bit about Wolf and Edwalker and read Wolf and Edwalker. And it's funny because I was thinking this morning about riddles, and I don't know if I told you this, Jenny and Megan, but in my publication in the London Review of Books, I had sent them a few poems, and they only liked my translations, and they wrote me back and they said, we would like to accept these, and it had taken so long that I had published those poems somewhere else, and I said, let me send you some riddles. And I sent them some riddles, and I included a fake riddle that was a poem that I had been working on that I just couldn't figure out how to make it work. And so I just retitled it as if it were a riddle. And I think it's called like Riddle 98 or something, which of course there's no such thing. And they accepted it. And I had to write them and say, I just want to make sure that you know, like, that this is okay. I wasn't trying to pull anything over on the LRB. Who wants to do that? And I was like, I just want to make sure you know that this is not really an Old English riddle. They were okay with it. They didn't say whether they knew or not. I thought it was quite obviously not. But so, all right. It may be, well, first I'll just say that I'm going to talk and read for a while from pieces of paper that I'm looking at and notes that I have, and I'm not going to do any fancy screen sharing or images. So I'm just going to prepare you for this. Is a very old-fashioned Zoom presentation. I'm going to read from notes for a while, and then I'm going to read some poems, and then we'll see where we are, and I would love to take any questions. as I was working on this, I was thinking that perhaps it's because I haven't left my house basically for a year, but I've been having more and more trouble distinguishing or locating the boundaries between roles and states of being. How can I pause being a parent, for example, to teach a class when there might be several toddlers beating down the door? So I'm going to speak today as a scholar, but I think especially as a poet and as a human being. While this series of talks is focused on the medieval, I'm going to begin in 1990 by quoting from an article that is of crucial importance to me as a human being. Judith Butler's essay, Imitation and Gender Insubordination, which became part of their foundational work of queer theory, Gender Trouble, which maybe some of you know. I have it on good authority that Judith Butler was the first person in line in the state of California when they said that you could go to the Department of Motor Vehicles and change your pronouns to they, them on your driver's license. Here in the United States, that they set their alarm for 6 a.m. and went to do that immediately. So this is from their essay. Here is something like a confession, Butler writes 7 pages in. As a young person, I suffered for a long time, and I suspect many people have, from being told explicitly or implicitly that what I am is a copy, an imitation, a derivative example, a shadow of the real. But gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. The naturalistic effects of heterosexualized genders are produced through imitative strategies. Heterosexuality is always in the process of imitating and approximating its own phantasmatic idealization of itself and failing. Then Butler continues with this, what I consider to be humor. If it were not for the notion of the homosexual as copy, there would be no construct of heterosexuality as origin. Heterosexuality here presupposes homosexuality. And if the homosexual as copy precedes the heterosexual as origin, then it seems only fair to concede that the copy comes before the original, and that homosexuality is thus the original and heterosexuality the copy. This text is 30 years old, so it's more recent than Beowulf, but old enough that Butler lacked terms like transgender and cisgender. And one of the most dated things about the essay is the fact that much about gender is cloaked in language about sexuality. But theoretically, and more importantly to me, experientially, this is how it felt to grow up as a transgender child, constantly accused, with or without inadequate language, of doing or being something wrong, of being inaccessible, unnatural, out of bounds, damaged, illegible. The poem that made me fall in love with Old English poetry was The Ruin, where an unknown speaker looks out and describes a ruined city, an ancient text about an even older place. And this speaker has an experience I have never had, and I think probably none of you have ever had either. They're looking out at the ruins of something they perceive to be more advanced than anything that they know. And they're marveling and stunned at the intricacy and design of the city, and then trying to imagine how something so incredible could have come to be destroyed. I was surprised at how the poem was able to move me, but I was even more shocked when I looked at the poem in Old English and saw the gaps there in the manuscript from the notorious hot poker incident regarding the Exeter book. Looking at the ragged, burned sections in the poem, I now could not make sense of the translation I had read, which seemed so complete in narrative and grammar. So smooth, everything accounted for. I found more translations, which all similarly elided the damage in the poem. I expressed my desire soon to myself to learn Old English well enough to translate the poem myself, and began to study. I talked to my colleagues about this desire in scholarly terms. I said things like, This poem about a ruin obsessively describing gaps and damage has itself become a ruin full of gaps, and it is an error in scholarship not to deal with what exists, rather than to deal in back formation, to fake it. I stand by that argument, but privately I felt rage and despair at the way the ruin and other fragmented poems, including many of the riddles, were being fixed, made accessible. And I slowly realized that I was identifying physically with the poems from the positionality of my own body. I began to see my poems and my translations approaching a relationality akin to that described by Austrian Jewish philosopher Martin Buber in his famous I-thou dynamic. Buber's terms insist on relations between and among words. For him, words do not stand alone, but exist in contact with other words. They do not signify things, they intimate relations. Initially, I saw Old English poetry, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit, primarily as material I could mine for content in my own poetic practice. But soon, as I became more adept, my initial objectifying interest became a gesture towards inhabiting betweenness. This state of betweenness is crucial, I think, to any translator, insofar as we act as conduits, bodies of change between texts. This relationality changes the I. Buber uses two primary word combinations, I, thou, and I, it, to describe all relationships. There is no I, Buber argues, aside from these two dynamics. I does not exist alone, but only in relationship. My work as a translator metaphorically adapts this connection, and I regard my process as a continuing desire for an I-thou relationship with my sources. This is an attempt on my part to reject the boundaries of time and space that would seem to separate me from Old English poetry. The I in an I-it dynamic exists in relationship to boundaried experience, to objects. It has some thing for its object. On the other hand, the I-thou relation defies boundaried relations and expands beyond the realm of things. As Buber puts it, thou has no bounds. The speaker has no thing. He indeed has nothing, but he takes his stand in relation. It is this relationship I try to inhabit, one where the I is removed from the solitary subject position and placed into energetic, intimate, respectful equilibrium with thou. Buber's thinking interrogates temporality. What he considers the true or filled present exists only insofar as actual presentness, meeting, and relation exist. In other words, any I-thou relationship exists in the present. It is not distinguished from the past or future on a linear scheme, but it is a state of being that exists in relation. Transversely, the I-it dynamic, which exists in the realm of objects, occurs only in the past, because objects subsist in time that has been. The world of it is set in the context of space and time, whereas moments of the thou appear as strange, lyric, and dramatic episodes. As it evolved, I realized my translation work was assuming this I-thou relational poetics at the intersection of translation, queer theory, and the Old English lyric. While attempts at knowing and pinning texts in time are crucial aspects of translation, much of contemporary queer theory is interested in conversations around queer nonlinear time. I lost my place on the page. This is this is a physical moment. Where am I? Yes, and interested in conversations around queer nonlinear time and in not knowing. As scholars like Jack Halberstam, Judith Butler, Jose Munoz, and Elizabeth Freeman make connections between space and temporality, gender, originality, identity, and artistic failure. These writers have been crucial to my understanding of damaged anonymous medieval texts. Notably, in A Queer Time and Place, Jack Halberstam reappropriates Judith Butler's phrase gender trouble as gender turbulence. For Halberstam, the word turbulence, as opposed to trouble, marks movement in time and space, locating time and space on and in the transgender body in ways that offer the body as a site of ongoing reinvention. So the intersection at which queerness, textual fragmentation, and translation work meet is provocative to me because it gives rise to this temporal confusion and linear breakdown. Linear, I find to be a wonderfully ambiguous term. And in fact, one of the things that started to happen for me the more I worked on translating Old English was that my own poems, which had once been very rigidly left justified on the page, began to take up space differently. And I still will, when I look back at the unstill ones even, I look at poems. I was looking at a poem the other day and I looked at it and I said, this looks like it's in half lines. And I had not even noticed that before. And in fact, my poem on trans, the way that it looks is on the page is so influenced by reading Old English poetry. So linear, as in the lines of a poem advancing, which in the case of the Old English fragment break down visibly on a page, or linear as the narrative of a life or a poem that moves convincingly through expected steps toward a conventional end. Discussions of queer temporality have focused primarily on unpacking and decentralizing the narrative mode of straight time, but so far have not said much about lyric poetry, not enough to satisfy me at any rate. But this infusion of flexibility and variety is crucial to a translator engaged in a language and culture as distant from us as Old English, particularly where lyric poems are involved. These poems do not come alive for the reader because of a narrative understanding. Rather, if they speak to the reader, it is because they employ lyric address, creating an atmosphere that Buber would call the filled present. So one example that I'm just going to briefly talk about of how this actually works is in regard to my translation of Wolf and Eadwacher. Wolf and Eadwacher employs objective correlative as its main strategy to a singular lyric speaker. The poem relates multiple kinds of failure and fragmentation, describing a life unable to move forward without impediment. If anything, its speaker's inability to tell a clear story is what the poem is about. Its speaker is in a state of spatio-temporal disjunction. Queer temporality studies was originally informed by the radically altered sense of time that became apparent in the queer community during and after the AIDS epidemic. Suddenly, it became clear that queer lives did not follow the same temporal structure as straight lives. To put it most brutally, in those years, they were much shorter. While that was its starting place, the utility of queer temporality studies has moved beyond a way of rethinking lives lost and damaged by AIDS and offers definitions of straight time and queer time that offer some illumination of poems like Wolf and Eadwacher. Jack Halberstam describes straight time as a cultural construct that imagines normative life advancing from birth to marriage, followed by childbirth, child-rearing, and death. Halberstam defines straight time as narrative time, the normative life cycle whose stages we're all familiar with. This cycle, Halberstam points out, is mirrored in the smaller cycles of a capitalist economy. One rises in the morning at a reasonable hour, goes to work, comes home for a family dinner, goes to bed at another reasonable hour, then does it again the next day. In this model, even the off-work times are prescribed. Evenings and weekends are part of straight time, as is going to work. Queer time, then, is any time spent outside of or in rejection of or resistance to this cycle. In queer time, one may accomplish nothing, or at least what might seem like nothing, when judged by the standards of straight or capitalist time. If we see straight time as shaping the story elements of a poem like Wolf and Eadwacher, it's completely unfathomable. Wolf and Eadwacher exists in total opposition to the assumed linearity of straight time. In Wolf, the most attentive straight time reading can provide only a bewildering jumble of narrative loose ends. The speaker is different from her love interest. She is separated from him for reasons which may or may not have to do with this difference. She chooses or is forced into a relationship with another man. She finds this other man enjoyable or not. She spends some amount of time doing something in a place we don't know, in a state of despair about one or both of these men. She bears a child to an unspecified father at some time that we don't know, and winds up in a woods somewhere concerned for her child who may or may not be lost or missing, about to die, already dead. And she is in this internal conversation with and possibly waiting to meet one or both of the men. That's basically a summary of my translation. And this long sentence, just sort of like this rendering would not have been possible without the theoretical framework of queer temporality theory, which is built on decades of work in queer and gender studies. What does it mean to bring these texts and sensibilities to bear on Old English translation? My rendering of Wolf and Eadwater, for example, which I will read in a few, it embodies, I think, what Jose Munoz calls tactical misrecognition, which I sometimes term radically literal. And the article where Jose Munoz is talking about tactical misrecognition, I need a sip of water, is an article that Munoz wrote about the amazing performance art of a drag performer named Vaginal Cream Davis, who, if you don't know the work of Dr. Davis, Google that immediately. This human is a genius, and Jose Munoz is writing about their performance as a character called Clarence, as an act of tactical misrecognition. It's a wonderful article. So the poem in Old English is so prototypically lyrical that the choice past translators have made to imagine a narrative results in a seeming realness. See, notice the way that we can use this language having to do with drag, right? To talk about translation. Results in a seeming realness, which simultaneously erases the difficulties of this performance and the murkiness of its source text. As one of the few Old English poems written in the voice of a woman, this erasure is particularly egregious. The poem gestures at aspects of cultural confusion, punishment, and sexual violence rarely depicted in Old English. And in this and other poems, I see a need and an opportunity to speak with and back to rather than for history. My version of Wolf and Eadwater attempts to hold multiple readings open at the same time in a way to speak to and question that speech. This translation utilizes Halberstam's understanding of trans as a term of relationality and failure as a queer art. Trans, the root of translation, comes to us from the Latin. It's a prefix defined by the OED as having the sense across, through, over, to, or on the other side of, beyond, outside of, from one place, person, thing, or state to another. This offers us the sense of change, of transformation. Indeed, the word transformation itself is a transformation. In a literal sense, any word using the prefix trans is a transformation, occupying a space of movement and change. In Halberstam's A Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies, Subcultural Lives, he provides a wonderfully subtle definition of the word transgender, noting that nowhere in the effect of naming our identifications been clearer in recent years than in relation to the experience we call transgender. He classifies the term as an experience rather than a static state of being. He understands transgender as a vernacular term developed within gender communities, a way to name the experience of people who identify with a gender identity other than their assigned one, and who are differentiated from transsexuals by picking and choosing freely between the cultural and medical interventions available to them. The term transgender in this context refuses the stability that the term transsexual may offer, and it embraces more hybrid possibilities for embodiment and identification. Most importantly, both terms are consistently reconstructed publicly and communally. Transsexual is not merely the medical term for the vernacular transgender, but rather, quote, both transsexuality and transgenderism shift and change in meaning as well as application in relation to each other, rather than in relation to a hegemonic medical discourse. This relationship is crucial to Halberstam, who sees the term transgender as a term of relationality, not simply an identity, but a relation between people within a community or within intimate bonds. This for me recalls Buber's description of I, thou. So then the term transgender is a useful example of the prefix trans and what it makes space for. Trans refers not only to moving or changing through or across as a choice in terms of a single subject's gender identity or representation, but also to a relationship between and across languages and communities in terms of their relationship with each other. In other words, one person's self-description as transgender has resonance in a gender community as a whole and continually changes or reflects on other gendered language used in that community. This definition of relationality is ripe for me to borrow as a way to talk about modes of translation, particularly given the way that poems speak to each other and change each other across time. So I'm going to read a few poems and translations from the Unstill ones and a couple of newer things as well, each of which is in relationship to what I consider an embodied translation practice, which has emerged for me as a core element in my work as a poet and a translator. When I began this work, I thought of my translation work as truly separate from my poetic practice, but that has become less and less the case over time. For me, translating damaged and fragmentary texts has offered me a way to express what is damaged or fragmentary in my own non-translated poems. The act of care, I think, in trying to represent fragmented texts without rejecting their damage offered me new ways to represent my own embodied experience on the page. I have a practice of holding up my hands like this to show where there's a gap and text is missing. So that's another way for me that I developed of embodying and holding space. So when you see me do that, that's what I'm doing. And because Old English is so formal, we're often really able to know exactly how much is missing, right? So I sort of try to imagine a pause where text would have been, but is not. So I think that I'm gonna start by reading Wolf and Eadwater in Old English. And if you'll bear with me, because I think probably that this is my biggest pandemic splurge purchase. I think that I'm gonna say this. The poem in my book that I regret the most is that I included a non-radically literal translation of Wolf and Eadwater. And I think it's as good as anybody else's, which is to say it gets it all wrong. So I'm gonna read Wolf and Eadwater in Old English, and I think and then I'll read my translation, which I do feel good about. And you'll see that the one in Old English is much shorter. Wolf and Eadwater. Leodum isminum, swilcha him on gifa, without he hina athajan yif he on threat kimith, anyalik is us. Wolf is on Iga, ich on othera, fast is that Elund, fena beworpen, sindan wal reoa, whereas fair on Iga. Without he hina athajan yif he on threat kimith, anyalika is us. Wolfis ich minis with lastum wenum hogoda thana hit was rainy weather and ich reo to gusat thana mech se beadu kafa bagum biligda was me win to than was me wafra eak lav wolf mean wolf wena me thina seoka gididon thina seldkimis murnenda mod nales metalista Yehiris tu Eadwater, uncerna erna quelp birith wolf to woda. That mon etha to slitev, thata navra yesomnad was, unker gied yedor. little rusty on that. Wolf and Adwalker. This poem is either about a woman separated from a man by a petty tribal war, or about a woman forced to live with a second man because of a petty tribal war. Either way, she bears a child. Either way, one man is kept prisoner on an island, guarded by bloodthirsty swords. Either way, the woman sits crying in the rain, sheltered by trees. Or it could be the rain is crying. Or it could be there is no rain. She's only using it as an image. The second man, who is not the island prisoner, whose name means possession watcher, comes to the woman to protect her or imprison her, or because he wants a woman just then, and so fucks her. This feels good to her because she's lonely, or likes a good fuck sometimes, or because she loves the second man, not the first. But afterwards, it sickens her out of loyalty to the imprisoned man, or because the second man seemed pleasing at first, but then less so. The child is sent to the woods to die or kill or escape with the island man, who may have got free of the bloodthirsty men or stuck them with their own swords. Then there is either an eagle or a cruelty, or cruelty to the woman has always seemed inseparable from eagles, or the one who copied her poem suffered from partial blindness and wrote the wrong word entirely. Certainly sharp-edged things, carnage, slaughter, or the island was only an image and there was never an island. She only meant, we seem so distant from each other, we might as well be on two islands separated by a hard salted sea, and neither of us shipbuilders. In this case, there were no islands, men, or swords, but instead a hopeless separateness ending in a wood full of wolves, or a man called Wolf. And though she has known hunger, it is not hunger that carves her belly with dread, but longing for a man or child or wolf, because it is easy to separate that which has never been joined, meaning the second man has no true claim on her, or the first, or the life of the child in the woods is worth less than the frost of breath hanging briefly on a cold night, soon eaten by the cold. And when it disappears, who is to say then what it meant, what form it had, whose mouth released it thoughtlessly, or perhaps looked at it and knew how small a time its form would hold against the night. Those were notes that I wrote after 2 days trying to translate the poem like a real translator. And then I realized that was my translation. And I wrote another poem that was also about being frustrated at my inability to properly translate Wolf and Adwalker. I began it that same week. And only yesterday did I realize that on trans is written in these half lines with caesura between them. So I'll read it. On trans. The process of through is ongoing. The earth doesn't seem to move, but sometimes we fall down against it and seem to briefly alight on its turning. We were just going. I was just leaving, which is to say, coming elsewhere. Transient. I was going as I came. The words move through my limbs, lungs, mouth as I appear to sit peacefully at your hearth, transubstantiating some wine. It was a rough read. It was one of those nights we were not forced by circumstances to drink wine out of mugs. Circumstances being, in those cases, no one had been transfixed at the kitchen sink long enough to wash dishes. I brought armfuls of wood from the splitting stump. Many of them, because it was cold, went right on top of their recent ancestors. It was an ice night. They transpired visibly, resin to spark, bark to smoke, wood to ash. I was transgendering and drinking the rough red at roughly the same rate, and everyone who looked saw. The translucence of flames beat against the air, against our skins. This can be done with or without clothes on. This can be done with or without wine or whiskey, but never without water. Evaporation is also ongoing, most visibly in this case, in the form of wisps of steam rising from the just washed hair of a form at the fire, whose beauty was, in the earth's turning, that night and many nights, transcendent. I felt heat changing me. The word for this is transdesire, but in extreme cases, we call it transdire. Or when the heat becomes your maker, we say transire. Or when it happens in front of a hearth, transfire. I'm gonna read a couple of riddles, and because I know you're really here for the riddles. I need to maybe I can train one of my children to hold a book for me so that I can hold my hands up for the gaps. I'm gonna start with riddle 63, which there are not many translations of, and really I was joking about this on Twitter the other day, but because I was praised for having made a queer translation, but I was like, I just wrote down what they said. And so I think in this case, it was my own laziness as a translator that is what produced the queer translation, because I think people are avoiding people are just adding and avoiding what they view to be damaged. Riddle 63. Often I shall say, I am beautifully useful to the hall joy when I am borne forth, glad with gold to where men drink. Sometimes in the closet, the good servant kisses my mouth where we two are twice as long, outstretched arms on hands, works his will. Filled that I come forth. I cannot conceal the in daylight. Men are with sound token marked, who me too, the man you two were riding. This is riddle 94. Smoother, higher than heaven, gladder than the sun, steel, sharper than salty, more beloved than all this light, lighter now. I'm gonna read the ruin, and let's see.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt, Miller. I'm just conscious that you've been talking a long time, so I don't know if you want to. I'm dying to hear what you want to say about the ruin, but I'm just conscious it's quite a long one, so it's up to
Okay,
your call.
we can stop. I'm happy to stop and take questions if people have them.
I don't know. What do you think, Megan? Should we? I mean, I want to hear the ruin, but
let's have the ruin and then stop at the end. It seems like an appropriate place to stop anyway.
Great,
that was my plan. But if people need to jump up and down and shout, I'm all for it. Okay, I'll read the ruin and then we'll stop for questions. Wondrous is this wallstone, broken by fate, the city burst apart, the giant work crumbled. Roofs are ruined, towers ruined, rafters ripped away, hoarfrost on lime. Gaps in the storm shelter, sheared and cut away, under-eaten by age. The earth grip holds the mighty makers, decayed and lost to time. Held in the hard gripping ground while 100 generations of people watched, then died. Often this wall waited, lichen gray and red stained, through one kingdom after another, stood against storms, until steep, deep, it failed. Yet even now the heaped over with remains savagely scraped, grimly ground up, shown. Skillful work, ancient building, earth rind bent, the mind, swift motion, the mind renowned one bound up in firm rings, house walls, wonderfully with wire strips. Bright were the fort buildings, bathhouses, a wealth of high gables, much martial sound, many mead halls full with joy days, until the force of fate turned that. Bodies died all over the place in battle. Days of pestilence came. Death swept away all the sword brave men. This came to be their strife place. Their waste places, their battle places became blasted waste. The fort place rotted apart. The repairers died, armies to the earth. For that reason, these houses are failing. The red expanses, the open places and shelters, and the woodwork of the roof. The place of ruin fell, broke into mounds, where once many men, mood glad and gold bright, clothed in gleaming, gold adorned and wine flushed, war gear shining, and looked on treasure, silver, curious gems, on property, on lands, on jewel stones, on this bright city, this broad realm. The stone halls stood, the hot stream gushed in a wide billow, and a wall held all of it in its bright breast. And that bath was hot in its heart. That was fitting. Then they let flow hot streams over old stone until the ringed pool hotly where they were. When is that is a kingly thing. House, city. I'll stop talking now. I think that part of what frustrated me so much reading people's translations of the ruin is the way, especially at the end, it really, when you look at the translations, it seems like this finished thing. And it's really destroyed. Beautifully destroyed.
Thank you so much, Miller. I'm sure there will be lots of questions coming, but I have the great privilege of starting everything off while everyone's typing away. So I was going to ask you to start out with is like, why Old English? And you've already answered that question quite a lot. So my question's a little bit different. You started with Old English because you found it inaccessible and broken, and there was a process there that you enjoyed. But now that you've been doing it for a while and you're better at it, that inaccessibility must be lessened, and your relationship with these texts must be a bit different. So what, you said you can't escape from it quite yet. What keeps bringing you back? What about Old English poetry keeps bringing you back? Why is it working with your practice?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm working on a new book, and I initially thought there would be no translation in it. And then I found myself suddenly translating the entirety of the Phoenix, or at least I'm trying to. I think that one answer to your question is probably, I don't know. But I think when you begin with something and it feels quite strange, then it starts to feel a bit like a friend. Maybe I'm just going back, but there's something to me that's so compelling, that continues to be so compelling about the way that Old English poetry just uses language. And I was at a talk that Seamus Heaney gave years ago, and he was asked where he got his ear for sound, because his sound in his poems is so wonderful. And he said, at my school growing up, we only had the book Hamlet for 4 years. I have it memorized. What's in your head is what comes out. And it keeps being, for me, that Old English language and construction and syntax being in my head helps me with other things. And I don't necessarily know why.
That's a good answer for me, because I mean, I love it too. But I don't have a better answer for justifying it either, but I am really glad to hear that your relationship with it is going to continue. That's very good news. Okay, should I turn over to you now, Neville? Or?
Oh yeah, okay. So I think the plan, Miller, was that I was going to see what questions we had in chat and kind of select some. I've got some of my own as well, actually. I'll jump in. So the first question that's come up. Okay, here's a question. How can Old English poetry, such as Wolf and Jadwacha, how can it be made more accessible to less interested parties?
I think that I really struggle with accessibility as a concept, especially as a positive concept. It seems to me that it just often is a word that stands in for making something sound contemporary, and it just kind of like turns into something that I think we're at the risk of turning these poems into something that sounds like contemporary sort of workshop verse instead of something really new. And I guess my experience has been that when we talk about these poems to people, from our own positionality, like, then they just are accessible. And I don't know, I mean, when I first started my graduate work and I started becoming interested in Old English, all of my friends who are like queer artists and musicians living in New York City basically were like, what are you possibly doing? Why are you interested in this? Why should I be interested in Beowulf or whatever, right? Like, but then once you start talking to people about it, and I'm sure many of you have found this, people are actually fascinated by this. These are the origins of our own language, many of us. And I think that it's sort of innately compelling when we speak about it from our own curiosity. That's a long-winded non-answer.
That's great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to save my questions and I'm going to pick some others. Oh, Megan, okay, this is Megan's question. She has a question about the unstill ones and your use of runes to separate the sections. Why did you choose to include runes?
That's a great question. And this is something that I should really, if I were a proper scholar, that I would have written an article about. But I'm a poet and not an improper scholar, so I haven't. The first poem that I translated, that I would say I really translated, was the Old English rune poem. I was using it to kind of practice on. But the more that I read about it, the more unsatisfied I was with how other people were translating it. I think it's a poem that has had a great disservice done to it. It's translated often as a kind of joke. It's made to rhyme sometimes. It's presented as a kind of teaching tool, like as if it were being used for students, for medieval children to like memorize the alphabet. And when I started reading it, I was like, this poem is serious. Like, this is for real. This is the way that we know even what the runes were. And when that language was being destroyed in the process that I think people refer to as depaganization. And like that poem is the only reason that we even have those runes and definitions. And it became very kind of dear to me. And I think that what I noticed it's been a long time since I've read scholarship on that poem, but what I found was that anyone who was trying to write about the actual pagan elements of the poem was like being severely sort of shot down by a more conservative sort of Christian interested narrative about the poem. And so that's why I use those for separation. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Okay, let's scroll down, see what else. Thank you, that was very interesting. Can you talk a little more about your physical embodiment of these gaps in the text with the gesture of your hands? And if it is something that you would do in a, I've lost it, in a kind of performance space, it seems to work so well in this digital format.
That's a great question, thank you. I think one of the things that I said in the talk, and I don't know, it took me a long time to understand this, but the reason that I was so upset, I think, as an artist, I was really driven towards this work out of a feeling of pain, of like suffering that arose in me when I saw the way that these fragmented poems were being treated. And it took me a long time to understand that it was really about the way that I had been treated about my own body, my own embodied representation, which for me at the time that I was working on this project was still like sort of ongoing. And I actually hadn't come out as trans yet when I started this work. And actually, I think that part of what propelled me to being able to understand that about myself was doing this work. And I think how upset I was about these things being treated as damaged was something I felt so intensely in my own body. And I was like, what is this? Why am I so upset about this thing written 1100 years ago or whatever? Why do I care if someone only used one set of ellipses to indicate an entire burned section of a book? Why am I so mad about this? And I think for me, that kind of worked really well with my own process. Now there are children screaming outside my door, but my own process as a poet that I already had, which is very physical, and I like sort of pace when I work. I don't know if anyone relates to this. I pace, I talk to myself, I move my hands. So I think that sort of arose naturally out of that as a way to further embody those poems, which is how I already kind of felt. But yeah, it works well in person, I think, too. As I never thought of myself as a performer or a performance poet of any kind, but I think that is another interesting way that in a sense, working with these ancient texts caused me to be doing things that a lot of poets are doing in contemporary practice, taking up space differently on the page, having a more performative aspect during a reading. Like those were not things I was doing before I started working with Old English. And I there's something very funny about that to me, that it in some way made my work more contemporary.
Interesting, thank you. Okay, if we go to the next question. I love On Trans so much, and I find that students really want to discuss it in relationship to the translations of Old English. Could you talk briefly about how and why you chose to read it today?
I missed the beginning part of that.
Oh, sorry. I love On Trans so much and find that students really want to discuss it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that poem really arose for me organically out of my Wolf and Aid Walker translation, as I said, and I wrote it from a perspective of trying to understand my own practice as a translator. And again, I think sort of what I just said about the hand gestures, like I realized through working on that poem, I was like, oh, this is not actually just about translation. And so there was a sense of discovery for me as I was working on it, which in my mind is the best way to write. If I sit down and I know what I'm going to do, I'm going to do something really bad. And if I don't know what I'm doing at all, possibly something interesting might happen. And I think that's really what happened there. It was the first poem published in in Poetry Magazine to use the word transgender, which is the, like, at least they're sort of embroiled in scandal now, but has been for 100 years, for over 100 years, the kind of premier poetry journal in the United States. And for that to have been the first time that word was in there, that's something I was very proud of. But it wasn't my intention when I sat down to work. And I think that friction in the poem is probably what's interesting to students reading it, that you think one thing is happening and then there's other things happening as well.
That's great, thanks. I think we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. Here's a really interesting one. Have you thought of translating the manuscript materiality in your poetic practice? There is a lot, as you know, of queer touching in time and manuscript production, Dinshaw and others.
Interesting. I'm not sure that I completely understand that question.
Yeah. Let's see. So have you thought about translating the manuscript materiality?
Dennis, if you want to clarify verbally, go for it.
Yeah.
Hi, Miller. I was thinking, you know, I mean, this is printed and it is material, and you know, but just have you thought? And this, of course, depends on, you know, what you're comfortable as doing as sort of an artist. You know, this kind of creating by hand things, or finding a way of suggesting that handcrafted animal body, maybe a more vegan version of that. I'm not saying you should kill animals and make manuscripts. Sort of suggesting that kind of materiality, because there's something queer about touching, and there's a lot about queer touching, and you know, Dinshaw wrote about this. That would be sort of an extra dimension of what you've been talking about.
I love that idea. Yeah, no, I mean, I love that idea. That's not something that I've really thought about in terms of production, I would say. Like, it's very much part of my practice. I write by hand first drafts, or I use a typewriter sometimes too, to kind of really slow down and not look at a screen. And like, you know, I have my briefcase looks like the briefcase of like a total nut. It's like full of scraps of paper, you know, that I typed on. And like, if I need to go work on a draft, like it might be hard to find them and they're all crumpled. So I think that I allow myself in my process a huge amount of that kind of materiality, but it's not something that has actually translated over into a product. And I think probably, I mean, the poet who, and I don't often mention them, and maybe it's because it's like too close, but for me, the poet who I've like looked to in some ways the most is Anne Carson, who's like, when I first started with Old English, I was like, oh, nobody's doing with Old English what Anne Carson is doing with Ancient Greek and with Latin, right? And so like partly the answer to your question, I think, is that if I were extremely famous, like Anne Carson is, like, she gets to make these things, right? And she's making the kind of things that you're talking about. I think her book Knox, for example, which is incredible, which folds out into an accordion, and the left side of each page is just the definition of one Latin word from this Catullus poem, Catullus 101. If you haven't looked at this book, Dennis, are you going to hold it up? If you haven't looked at this book, it's so worth your time. And at first I didn't want to buy it because I was like, what is this too expensive coffee table book? But it's absolutely incredible. Dennis, just be with me all the time to do this. Yeah, you can see, like, it's amazing. So, and what it is a reproduction of her journal as she's processing. It's like a scrapbook and a journal aspect to it. So yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that. I would like to make cool things like that. Now Dennis is just in an Anne Carson world.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, great, thanks. Oh, sorry, no, please on.
No, when I was writing my my exams, when I was doing my PhD exams, I was using like, I was writing about Anne Carson, and it was like 3 a.m. and I hadn't slept in 2 days, and I was trying to cite her, and it's just like, there's no page numbers, you know, it's impossible. And I was just like, but this is, everything, right? This is the point. And it's so medieval too. Yeah, it's really great. So much
Judy
love.
Kendall has just commented that she says the ideal way to read Knox is throw it down the stairs.
Brilliant. Do we have time for a couple more questions? I think we do, don't we? Okay. Friend's question. Okay, so this is relating to Jose Esteban Munoz's article, I think. This was fascinating and wonderful to hear your readings and to see the gestural quality of the gap translations. I loved the idea of tactical misrecognition, and I wonder if you think there is always an element of tactical misrecognition involved in translation.
That's such a good question. Whose question was that? That's a great question.
That was Francesca Brooks.
Yeah, of course. I think probably the answer is yes. And I think, like, I've often joked about myself that I'm just like an overly literal person. And I think for me, like the tactical like the way that I misrecognize things, how do I say this more eloquently? I think that when we tactically misrecognize, it's almost like an ultra close proximal reading for me. And it's something that can offer us, like Wolf and Aidwalker is not like my Wolf and Aidwalker translation is not really a translation, but it's also the most honest translation that I could make. And so on one hand, it's like completely wrong. And on the other hand, it's fact. It's like honest fact. And I think that that's something that can be applied almost all the time, but it has to change. And I think that's what's so hard about, for me, what's so tricky about being a poet too, is that you're reinventing the wheel every time. Like you write a poem and it works out, and then you're like, oh, now I have to write another one. How do I do that again? Like, what was it that I did? And I think translation should be done the same way, where you just really look and you're like, what's here? And that aspect of misrecognition, but you have to be honest about it. And I think that's another thing that has really frustrated me about some translations. And I'm reading it, and I'm like, you're just representing this as a translation, but it's really so much of your own stuff, and you're just putting it in there. And for me, that's not okay. That's like misgendering someone, right? That's like saying, well, it's most comfortable for me to refer to you by your dead name. And so that's something that I take personally. Yeah. And so again, tactical misrecognition, but acknowledge it.
Yeah, it has to be acknowledged. That's really interesting. Now I find this, I've been translating a bunch of Latin riddles recently, a lot of which haven't been translated, or they've only been translated into German and things like that. And when I do find translations of them, yeah, it's really common to find these kind of this tactical misrepresentation, misrecognition, and it's not acknowledged actually. So that's a really interesting point.
And what Jenny just said in the chat about the riddles, right? It's the only way to read them. Like, I agree.
Okay,
and it's more fun.
Got any more questions? I think we've got through all the questions. We have a lot of comments as well.
Yeah, I agree, Francesca, too, that this is freeing to students. Yeah. To be in that place of not knowing, right? And that's queer failure too. That you can just be in that place. I think all of this stuff is about, at the end of the day, really is about creating more freedom. And it's like, I think that if more straight people read queer theory, it would be really freeing for them as well, to be like, oh, you don't have to do that. Like, you don't have to wear that. And you don't have to translate that way.
Do you think all riddles like innately opposed to chromonormativity or not? I'm just wondering, this is off the top of my head, I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
Just wondering if it's like a kind of form that is innately opposed somehow to chromonormativity because you have to fail in some way. Or...
Yeah, and because I think that like, if I think about William Carlos Williams' definition of poetry as a machine, small or large machine made up of words, and the idea that a poem is a thing that makes something rather than is something that's been made, that it's an action that's always sort of ongoing, and that is brilliant with the riddles, because they are just always these actions of themselves that are doing something, and they ask us to engage with them.
Brilliant, great. If anyone has any questions, you've still got just about enough time if you want to put some in the chat. Or
I think we'll wrap it up there.
Not
but
wrap up.
Only because there aren't any. But I just want to say that now I feel terrible the way I've translated all the riddles on the Riddle Ages website with all my like random ellipses. Sometimes it's the full set of ellipses. Sometimes it's like, I've decided not to type any more dots today. But I've always kind of thought of the damage to the manuscript and the gaps as damage to the animal body, and as a kind of, it was so important to witness that damage to that animal body that, yeah, I just need to do it more consistently, I think.
Yeah, that, you know, one of the things that I discovered when I was translating for the book that you referred to as Raw earlier, which I hadn't thought to do, but is so great, was that I had been also using, like, the way that I had been using the brackets in the Unstollens. I changed it, and I started including, I was keeping the, when there's like one letter, right? And I had previously been keeping it outside of the brackets, but then Dennis is like, just has every book. I want to start shouting out books and to see what's there. But like, I was like, oh, where am I marking the damage, right? Is the broken thing that I'm saying is gone? Is it the whole word is gone, but now there's this letter? Where should the letter be? Should it be inside or outside? Am I going to say it out loud when I read it? How do we preserve this? Why do we care about this G sitting here? And how do we do it? And I started doing it differently all of a sudden. And I think just continuing to work like what you're talking about. I'm too tired to type these ellipses. Like, that's great though. It changes.
That's great. Thank you so much, Miller. You've been really generous in giving us so much more of your time. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful talk. I've enjoyed it so much. Could I ask everyone to perhaps turn their cameras on if you like, or just turn your, can we turn the microphones on to hear? Yeah, turn your microphones on and embody your appreciation by doing a round of applause.